Hello, and you're very welcome to episode 78 of The Fifth Court, a podcast on legal affairs presented by myself, Peter Leonard, barrister and mediator.
Myself, Mark Tottenham, barrister and trust and estate practitioner.
Yes, Mark, and good to see you as always. And last week, you will recall, we talked to solicitor Christian Boyno. Christian, who is originally from Poland, and he specialises in a range of commercial litigation. And it was a really interesting discussion about how, A, he came to Ireland in the first place, his wonderful qualifications from Poland.
In fact, he trained as a judge before becoming a solicitor.
Yeah. So there you go, 27, he could have been a judge.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, it was used to be always when the guards get younger than you, and then it's now the judges getting younger, but they would be younger than you a lot earlier, if that makes sense. Okay, well, tonight we are going guestless, Mark, and the reason is?
We are on the eve of Bloomsday, and very important that we, sitting here in the studio with our boater hats on, with our Joycean glasses.
Yes.
We're all set.
We're all set.
Day,
we're going to talk about a fascinating case. And of course, the 16th of June, 1904 was the original Bloomsday. And why was it called Bloomsday? Or why was that the day that was so special?
That was the day when when James Joyce met Nora Barnacle.
On Sandyman Strand, am I right?
I
think it was Sandyman Strand.
I think I remember some details of their encounter which aren't for family audiences.
Well, that's all right. We won't get to that at this stage. But I mean, I think Joyce was so enchanted by that day that he decided to set the most famous work of literature of the 20th century, I think it's fair to say, and it's based on that day. But the book was regarded as a dirty book and potentially a pornographic book, and it had been published in Europe in 1922, in France, in Paris, but it couldn't get into the English-speaking world. Yeah. And in the early 30s, there was a move to get it into the English-speaking world, to get it to America, to see if they could get over a potential ban. And that's what we're going to talk to. Me and you, you're the expert on this, Mark. We're going to talk about that later in the show.
Exactly.
Okay, so really looking forward. Folks, I think it'll be really interesting. So please stay with us. But before we get to that, we're going to look at 3 cases that you have identified from the Decisis website. And the first one is a High Court case. It had quashed a decision of the Minister for Justice to refuse visas for some children from Somalia on the grounds that there were exceptional circumstances that should have been taken into account. The Minister appealed this one. This is the case of FSH versus the Minister for Justice, and it's a decision of Mr. Justice Allen. He's the presiding judge in the Court of Appeal. Yeah,
so this is a case, it's basically a family reunification case. Some children from Somalia were looking for visas to join, I think, their mother in Ireland. And the minister refused that, saying that they didn't meet the criteria in the policy document. In the High Court, the judge took the view that there were exceptional circumstances for these particular children and that the visas should have been granted on humanitarian grounds. So they quashed the minister's refusal. This was then appealed by the minister, and the Court of Appeal allowed the appeal. They said that there were not the exceptional circumstances, or effectively there were no exceptional circumstances. That humanitarian grounds didn't apply.
Very interesting. Okay, thanks, Mark, for that. We turn now to a case about slopping out in Limerick prison. Wow, slopping out, still an issue. The plaintiff had been incarcerated between 2003 and 2004. So, okay, we're going back 20 years here. But issued proceedings in 2017. Am I getting a sense of delay here?
You can see what's going to happen here, exactly.
Yeah. The defendant sought to have the claim dismissed by way of preliminary hearing. This is the case of Moore versus the governor of Limerick prison, and it's a decision of Ms. Justice Phelan.
That's correct. So, it's these slopping out cases that arose from the fact that there were not proper toilet facilities provided in a lot of Irish prisons, that they had chamber pots, which may be bad enough if you're in a cell on your own. Very often people were put 2 or 3 to a single bed cell, and people effectively had to go to the lavatory in front of other people. And then the term slopping out was used for the fact that they had to bring their own results out and dispose of them. And this was, I think there was a case, I can't actually remember the case, quite a while ago, but in this case...
Kind of an appropriate case when we're about to discuss Ulysses, isn't it? There you go, sorry.
But anyway, for whatever reason, this particular case was brought in 2017, 13 years after the release of the plaintiff, and the defendant sought to dispose of this by way of preliminary issue, and the judge said there was really no grounds for extending the limitation period.
Okay, very good. And finally, to a case involving the HSE. And the HSE was challenged over its failure to investigate a complaint concerning an assessment of need within the statutory timeframe. You should have done it within this period of time. But the judge was also critical of the HSE's attitude towards the judicial review. This is a case of KR versus the Health Service Executive, and it's a decision of Ms. Justice Hyland.
Yeah, so what happens in disability cases is people apply for what's called an assessment of need. That's where the HSE is supposed to look at the needs of a particular person and make determinations. And what was particularly complained of here by Ms. Justice Hyland was the fact that the HSE in a lot of these cases was effectively waiting until judicial reviews happened and then kind of getting their skates on and providing the assessment. And she was saying, really they need to have their policies in place and not effectively give rise to this judicial review industry in relation to disability cases. So she said that she ordered them to expedite the disability complaint process and said that really they needed to get their procedures in better order.
Okay, very good, Mark. Thank you for that. And when we come back shortly, we'll be discussing the United States versus one book called Ulysses.
Clio, the most recommended cloud-based legal software used by 150,000 lawyers worldwide. Want to streamline case management, automate tasks including your client intake process and billing, while supported by a team of people 24/5. Visit clio.com/IE.
Silence in the Fifth Court.
Okay, Mark, so we're doing our own thing today on the Fifth Court. No guest, but we have done that before. Do you remember that wonderful case of Griffith and Griffith?
That's
up
right,
in
yeah. The nullity case.
The nullity case where they all went off camping back in the kind of Joycean era actually, back in the 20s. And you said it reminded you of a short story from Dubliners, and it was very like that. But today, to mark the fact that Bloomsday is upon us, and we are both wonderful Joyces, Mark, aren't we?
Up to a point of copper, yeah.
Well, I know you like to wear those boater hats and that wonderful jacket that you have.
Swanning around Sandy Cove.
That's it, And
after my swim,
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. But we thought we'd talk about a fascinating case. And this was the case that ensured that Ulysses, which had been published in Paris in 1922, was published for the first time in the English-speaking world. And that was in the start of 1934, I think. The case ran in 1933, I think. And that is the United States versus one book called Ulysses. And it's a fascinating case and how Ulysses came to be published in the United States, Mark. And I know this is something you've written about, and it's something that's very close to your heart. So shall we have a chat about that?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's have a little word about Ulysses first.
Yeah, well, I mean...
Admit it to the listeners. Have you read it, Mark?
Well, I won't say I have read it through from start to finish. Over the years, I've dipped into it a bit. But what I did do, I was a big fan of a podcast by the late Frank Delaney.
Oh, yeah, wonderful broadcaster, yeah.
Absolutely. He did a podcast called Joyce, where he basically took Ulysses page by page, or possibly even half page by half page. There were 400 episodes, and I remember at one stage during the podcast, he said his ambition was to finish it on his 100th birthday. But unfortunately, he was maybe just under halfway through the novel when he died very suddenly. So it was one of the highlights of my week was listening to that. He died in 2017. And so I certainly feel I have an understanding of the first half, because that was the bit that Frank Delaney covered.
Well, look, it's a very intense book to read.
Certainly,
I don't think I can say I've read it from cover to cover. I did in a previous life study English literature many moons ago before I studied law in UCD. I was way back in the 1980s, and I had the great pleasure of being taught, I suppose, Ulysses. I mean, it was on the course by the late Gus Martin. I don't know whether you remember him, Professor of Anglo-Irish Literature at UCD. The legendary, the late Seamus Dean, who we recently lost, and Declan Kybert, who was just incredible and who's still teaching and still an expert on Anglo-Irish literature. Yeah. So I did my best to keep up with it and listen to those very eminent scholars talking about Joyce. But actually the one thing that I really enjoyed, and it's interesting you talk about Frank Delaney, but RTE, the national broadcaster and public service broadcasting at its best, in the year of our Lord 1982, did a kind of a performance of Ulysses where they brought in well-known actors like Brendan Caldwell, Patrick Dawson, I think he played Stephen Dedalus, And they recorded the whole book with various different characters, giving voices to the characters in Ulysses. And it is absolutely brilliant. And many moons ago, I was delighted to get a gift of the box set, a set of CDs, which you could spend 24 hours. I think it took 24 hours to record the whole thing. But it's now on the website. So if anybody wants to get into it, and I know David Norris, who we obviously know is Joycean number one in this jurisdiction, well, I'm sure there's a lot of people who claim that. Yeah. He has always recommended, if you don't want to read it, sometimes to listen to it. And it's so dense. The text is so dense that it's a wonderful thing to kind of listen to people kind of enunciating the words in a voice, and you associate it with a character. And I think that's a much easier way for people to understand that content.
Have you ever seen the film with Milo O'Shea?
I have, when he played Leopold Bloom a long time ago. Was that Fionnuala Flanagan in it as well, was she?
Not sure. I think you could be right. But
Connell tells me it was Fionnuala Flanagan, who I had the pleasure of seeing only a month ago on the stage of the Gaiety Theatre in Sive. And she was amazing. Still an amazing actress. Why wouldn't she be amazing? But she was absolutely amazing. But yeah, there's been many, obviously.
We've both dipped our toe into Ulysses.
We've dipped our toe into Ulysses, and that's it. Okay, so let's go to this case. So this is the United States versus one book called Ulysses. And it was banned as such in America. And the ban predates the publication of Ulysses in 1922 by Sylvia Beach.
I'm not sure that it was banned by name, but I think what happened was that there was just general ban on obscene literature.
Well, my understanding is this. Now, I might be wrong. You know more about this than I do. But there was the publication of an extract. Before Joyce published the whole thing, Sylvia Beach in Paris all those years ago, 1922, she published the whole book. He had released parts of it at various different stages. And there was a short story published in an American magazine. And it was deemed to be about masturbation, and it was deemed to be obscene. And as a result, it was banned. And that, I think, had some implication then for Ulysses going forward. And that's why Random House. So will you take it up from there, Mark?
Yeah, well, I think what the background to this particular case was that Random House wanted to publish Ulysses in the United States, but obviously they didn't want to go to the expense of putting out an entire print run only to find that it was going to be seized by the censors and pulped. So what they did was that they contrived to import a copy and make sure that it was seized by customs in order to establish whether or not Ulysses was obscene in US law. And so what happened was it went before the federal district court in New York, and rather than going forward as a jury trial, there was an application to have the case dismissed. And so it was heard as an application to dismiss a case on obscenity. And so Judge Woolsey was the
and just to stop you there, just to kind of this is fascinating. The publisher created this.
Yeah,
the publisher said, "I want a court case to see, we want it to be tested to see if it's obscene."
Exactly,
and force the issue.
Yeah,
force the courts to consider this. And the Attorney General in New York, I think he sat on it for maybe 9 months or so, and then suddenly, eventually, he got. The publisher, Random House, got their opportunity to have this case then discussed in court.
Yeah. And I think there was obviously, it does seem to me that there was a bit of forum shopping going on, because probably New York was about as liberal a jurisdiction within the US. You can't really imagine if this was heard in sort of Mississippi or even Massachusetts at the time, whether it would have had such a sympathetic hearing. But it went before Judge Woolsey, who came from a very long-established New York family. I think his ancestors had in fact emigrated to New York when it was New Amsterdam, and he'd been associated with Yale University, and he'd already sat over a number of free speech cases. So they were, whether by accident or design, they were extremely lucky in their judge. And he then had to determine this issue of whether it was obscene or not.
Okay, so what did he say? He had to read the book to start with.
He had to read the book, and well, I mean, I might be jumping forward in terms of the judgment, but one of the interesting things about it was that, he said that he read it in its entirety. He said, "I've read Ulysses in its entirety, and I've read those passages of which the government particularly complains several times. It seems that the that the Attorney General more or less went through sort of picking out the dirty bits and in order to try and argue that this was not an appropriate book to be sort of let loose on the public. And he goes on to say, in fact, for many weeks, my spare time has been devoted to the consideration of the decision which my duty would require me to make in this matter. He says, Ulysses is not an easy book to read or to understand, but there's been much written about it, and in order properly to approach the consideration of it, it is advisable to read a number of other books which have now become its satellites. The study of Ulysses is therefore a heavy task. But the other thing, and this is where you need to kind of jump forward, he gave copies of it to two of his friends and asked them to read it to see what they thought of it. And again, rather than picking two random friends, it seems that these were two people who had some sort of literary experience, whose opinion on literary matters he valued, but he doesn't name them. And I think I think that would have been an almost automatic ground of appeal these days in Ireland anyway, because he was effectively making them expert witnesses in a case without giving anybody an opportunity to cross-examine them or to...
But isn't it a huge task? I mean, this incredible work of literature. And I mean, when it came to him, it was 10 years old as such. Yeah. And its legend would have travelled around the globe. It wasn't published in an English-speaking country at that stage, but its legend would have travelled. So he is the guy that's charged with letting it into America or not. Yeah. I mean, so why wouldn't he talk to two of his mates and say, listen, am I on the right track here?
Well, only because normally speaking, you would have you would have either an assessor or an expert who is actually put forward in the court, who's named, and who each side is able to have some indication of exactly what kind of advice they're giving the judge. Whereas he seems to have sort of said, right, I'll start my own little book group and see what my mates think of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, obviously, the suggestion was that it was pornographic. I think that was the whole idea, and that largely focuses on the ending of the book, Molly Bloom's soliloquy. Well, there's plenty in it throughout the book, obviously, but that was one of the main areas they focused on. Yeah. So Molly Bloom's soliloquy, Mark, why was that contentious?
Well, I mean, Molly Bloom's soliloquy. So much of what happens in Ulysses is what is happening in the heads of the protagonists. So basically the three main characters are Stephen Dedalus, Leopold Bloom and Molly Bloom. And elsewhere in the book, there's an episode where Leopold Bloom is described as, you mentioned before, masturbating. There are bits where he's described in reasonably graphic detail going to the lavatory. There's lots of stuff like that, which would have been considered earthy enough these days and would have been considered definitely beyond the pale back in the 1930s.
Can I tell you my favourite quotation from John Wolseley's decision? He says, I'll just see if I can read it here. Yeah. In respect to the recurrent emergence of the theme of sex in the mind of Joyce's characters, it must always be remembered that his locale was Celtic and his season was spring. So something to do with the Celtic nations there, he thought. Maybe that's the way we behave, is it?
Did he not realise that the 16th of June is the high summer in Ireland?
But anyway, Mr. Wolseley did the literary people of America some service because he allowed it in. So tell us a bit more about that.
So, going back to what you were saying about Molly Bloom's soliloquy, I mean, it would have been considered very unusual, to put it mildly, to be describing the sex drive of a woman in those days. People would. I mean, if you think of Lady Chatterley's Lover, which was 30, 40 years later, the description of a woman involved in sexual fantasy and that kind of thing would have been considered very unusual, and that obviously would have been part of it. And of course, it has been suggested that when she's saying yes, yes, yes at the end, who knows what's going through her mind?
Who knows? Okay, so look, this was huge. I mean, the word spread across the Atlantic. Joyce was in Trieste or wherever he was at that time. Was he in Trieste? I don't know where he was. Maybe Zurich, wherever he was in the 1930s. And this was huge for him. It had been published at long last. And they rushed out 100 copies, I believe, just to make sure it was published. Yeah. But there was an appeal. So let's talk about the appeal. And the appeal nearly became bigger than the original decision.
Basically, the two issues were, first of all, whether it was intended to be pornographic in its writing. And what he said was, although there are dirty or lewd or sexual parts, it is not designed to, I think he said, to excite the sex impulse in the reader. It's not designed to be erotic. And secondly, it isn't objectively obscene, but because the bits that are described as lewd or dirty or whatever are definitely in the context of what Joyce was trying to do. But there was an appeal, as you said, and that went before a 3-judge federal circuit court. And it's a very interestingly composed circuit court.
Yes, very interesting personalities. You're going to have to talk us through these, Mark.
So 2 of the judges the presiding judge, who I suppose we start with, was a man called Martin Manton, who, putting the cart before the horse maybe, but he was a presiding judge. He was quite a long-standing judge, but it turned out after the event that in the 1920s he'd lost a lot of money in the Wall Street crash.
Yes.
And he had started accepting gifts from litigants. Now, this didn't come to light until after the Ulysses case, but he actually ended up being charged with corruption and I think was imprisoned, and his conviction was confirmed on appeal. So he was the presiding judge. The other 2 judges, and I think, again, this is something that probably wouldn't be allowed these days, were first cousins with the unusual enough surname of Hand. One of them was Augustus Hand, and the other one had the very peculiar name of Billings Leonard Hand.
And was known as Leonard Hand.
Known as Leonard Hand, exactly.
And the other fellow was called Augustus Noble Hand. So there was a Noble Hand and a Leonard Hand.
Leonard Hand, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there you go. Well,
So
there's 2 great handles anyway, in fairness.
So they were first cousins, and definitely the more renowned of the 2 of them was Leonard Hand, who had been a judge since 1909. He had a very long record, again, like Wolsey, of cases concerning freedom of speech. He has granted an injunction during World War I to stop a ban on a satirical magazine called The Masses, this magazine had been involved in lampooning the war effort. So there was a suggestion that it ought to be censored, and he said, no, this should be allowed out. And it also, something I picked up online, said that as of 2004, he's been quoted more often by legal scholars and the Supreme Court of the United States than any other lower court judge. So he could be described as the palace of the United States.
Yes, he is a serious geezer and the darling of liberal America, even though there was a few blots on his copybook later on, but we might come back to that later, okay? But so the 3 boys have to decide whether Wolsey got it right or got it wrong.
Yeah, and there was a suggestion that the reason that Leonard Hand didn't write the majority decision was that he was almost too quotable, that they didn't want to make too big a deal of this judgment. So they gave the job of writing the majority decision to Augustus Noble Hand, as you said, who, like Wolsey, seems to have had a very sensitive understanding of Ulysses. You know, he starts off by saying that James Joyce is a pioneer among those writers who have adopted the stream of consciousness method of presenting fiction, which has attracted considerable attention in academic and literary circles. In this field, Ulysses is rated as a book of considerable power by persons whose opinions are entitled to weight. It has become a sort of contemporary classic. Dealing with a new subject matter, it attempts to depict the thoughts and lay bare the souls of a number of people, some of them intellectuals and some social outcasts, and nothing more, with a literalism that leaves nothing unsaid. So it really, again, doesn't just go straight in for the controversial bits, but a real understanding of the purpose of Ulysses.
Just to pick you up on that, I actually saw the quote because I had it written down. Of course, I can't find anything, but I found it now, and it says that Leonard and Noble Hand agreed amongst themselves that the opinion affirming Wolsey's ruling should, if at all possible, contain not a single quotable line. So they didn't want any salacious comment, or they didn't want any sensationalism. They just wanted to get to the job.
Yeah, well,
could you imagine a judge not wanting a quotable line?
Well, I read many judgments that are very unquotable, certainly.
You'd only be dying for a quotable line. I know what you mean. But so anyway, so they got into the weeds of it, and they had to consider whether it was pornographic, whether it would encourage those of unsound mind to get a bit excited, that sort of stuff.
And I mean, again, I wouldn't say this is unquotable at all. He says that numerous long passages in Ulysses contain matters that is obscene under any fair definition of the word cannot be gainsaid, yet they are relevant to the purpose of depicting the thoughts of the characters and are introduced to give meaning to the whole rather than to promote lust or portray filth for its own sake. the net effect, even of portions most open to attack, such as the closing monologue of the wife of Leopold Bloom, is pitiful and tragic rather than lustful, which I think is a very good way of putting it.
Okay, so there was a majority decision. The two hands, they were conjoined and,
the hands were definitely on the liberal New York.
The liberal side.
line.
But then there was the other fella, who was the Chief Justice, who ended up in Chokey a couple of years later.
Yeah. So
but he thought this was filth. And it was appalling stuff.
Yeah.
Stop it getting in and corrupting the morals of the good American people.
Yeah. And what does he say? He says, who can doubt the obscenity of this book after a reading of the pages referred to? So he went straight in for the dirty stuff, which are too indecent to add as a footnote to this opinion. Its characterization as obscene should be quite unanimous by all who read it. And then the other thing that was interesting was that the majority suggested, well, obviously, matters of the body, should we say, had to be published when it came to medical textbooks, and therefore why should they not be touched on in works of literature? And he doesn't agree with this at all. He says, Ulysses is a work of fiction. It may not be compared with works involving medical subjects or description of certain physical or biological facts. It is written for alleged amusement of the reader only. The characters described in the thoughts of the author may in some instances be true, but be truthful or otherwise. A book that is obscene is not rendered less so by the statement of truthful fact. So, he knew where he stood.
He was hardcore, yeah. The one I loved was he said that the book was simply to deprave and corrupt the morals of those whose minds are open to such influences.
Fantastic.
So people of weak mind. So look, this is huge. So the book was passed and cleared. Obviously, they had rushed out an initial publication run after the initial decision by Judge Wolseley. So now it was solid, and it could go and it could be distributed in America, and it could be widely published, etc.
Yeah.
And then it followed very shortly afterwards in the UK.
Yeah. And I think the UK allowed it in, but obviously there have been various kind of high-profile cases of this sort, and I suppose in the UK, the Lady Chatterley trial in the 1960s was the huge one where they had to decide whether Lady Chatterley's lover was too obscene to be published. And there's that famous line of where the judge said to the jury something like, "Would you allow your wife or servant to read such a book?" Which I think that alone probably turns the jury in favour of publishing it.
Well, there you go.
And but then the curious thing in Ireland, although we had censorship of literature from effectively independence earlier, Ulysses was never on the list of banned publications,
which is amazing. 1926 in Ireland, the new fledgling republic. They summoned together a group of Catholic priests and Protestant clergymen as well, and they
banned anything they possibly could,
and they set up this thing, the Committee of Evil Literature, under Kevin O'Higgins, then Minister for Justice. And the big thing they were after was the English tabloids, but they weren't tabloids in those days, I suppose the yellow press, you'd call them, I suppose, a little bit. They weren't red tops as such, but they wanted the News of the World banned in Ireland. They wanted various different publications, and there was loads of books. But isn't it amazing? Ulysses was not one of them.
And the reason is that nobody ever tried to publish it, because it was only when somebody actually tried to publish something that it came to the attention of the committee.
Yes, okay.
And so it was, I think, in 1968 that the more liberal Censorship of Publications Act came in, and after that, Ulysses was available here.
But I mean, famously in Dublin, it was, or in Ireland, it was, the only books that were worth reading were the ones that were on the banned list.
Exactly.
I mean, you think of somebody like huge now, John McGahern, the legendary John McGahern, whose movie, That They May Face the Rising Sun, is currently in the cinemas. I mean, what he went through in the 1960s, lost his job as a national school teacher in Clontarf.
Ended up having to emigrate.
INTO, we've had a go at them before in the Eileen Flynn case. We won't go back into that again, but didn't stand by him. So, I mean, that was, but anyway, this was the culture that existed at the time.
But the curious thing is, I think that the film of Ulysses with Milo O'Shea we were talking about earlier, I think was filmed in 1966, 67, before Ulysses was available on the shelf here. And so it was filmed, Ulysses was filmed in Ireland at the time when it was still not available for sale.
Wow. So there you go. Well, look, Mark, thank you for bringing that to our listeners. And that's a little, as I said, Bloomsday treat. It's kind of our legal take on Bloomsday. No doubt there's loads of people out there eating kidneys and as I said, wearing the boaters and going down to the Monticello Tower in Sandy Cove and, going off to Glasnevin to Paddy Dignam's funeral or whatever it is. So that's our little contribution from a legal point of view. Okay, well, Mark, as seen as we normally ask our guests at the end to recommend a book or a movie, it's just the two of us. I'm sure we know what we read, and there's no point in us asking that question. But is there that Frank Delaney podcast is something I think you really wanted to recommend?
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier, and I think it's definitely anybody who is interested in learning about Ulysses. It's still available on all podcasting apps. It's called Joyce, and I think there's about 400 episodes. And he just he brings Ulysses alive. I think it's fantastic.
He was a fabulous broadcaster.
Really was, yeah.
I didn't realise he'd died so many years ago. So, and a wonderful man, Frank Delaney. Okay, Mark, well, thank you very much for that. And I suppose we better just end the show now in normal fashion. Can we say a huge thank you to Conal O'Moran, who has produced this episode, and to Alison O'Dwyer, who's done such an amazing job recording this podcast. So from me, Peter Leonard.
And myself, Mark Tottenham.
We'll see you soon on the Fifth Court.